Congratulations to the university for putting on this wonderful first international webinar on education, recognising that there are many new challenges and opportunities in educational practices, both for the industrial issues, but also for society issues, and bringing together, as you would expect, from such a prestigious university, speakers from all around the world. What I would like to touch on today is the use of this global community to broaden the student mindset. So you can see what's represented in this image here is people from around the world bringing together a relationship which we expect and hope will impact on the mindset of the students as well. So what are the opportunities that we need to consider in educational practices? The conference breaks a reference to industrial and society, so we'll focus on that. Industrial, what does that mean? A globalization reset. We have seen through the pandemic that many relationships which we all took for granted during the pandemic, nation relationships, have been stressed. How do we know this? Well, we've all lived it, because when we were accessing PPE equipment, oxygen equipment, vaccines, we have seen that traditional friendships and allies have often withheld resources vital for our respective countries. So that means that globalization, although a force which will not be stopped, and in fact globalization has been in evidence for millennia, it's time for a reset. We've seen, for example, through India, where they have their self-reliance policy. This leads to more internal creation of education, innovation, entrepreneurship, manufacturing, self-reliance, yet also poses the necessary issue of internationalization, export and import. These days, the young are constantly faced with information about future employer needs. What is the future of work? Are we to be replaced with artificial intelligence, robots? Now, these two elements impact on education, because the future employer does have particular needs. These needs change over time. The education system needs to ensure that it trains students to be productive members of society, productive members within organizations, in addition to, should they wish to be entrepreneurs, business people, establish their own opportunities, to facilitate that as well. So, to reiterate, the globalization reset necessitates that new paths will be created as a result of the pandemic. And we're seeing those already. Future employer needs. Now, this is not a pandemic issue. Employers have always required different things at different stages of their existence. The employment needs in the 60s, 70s, 50s, in the early 1900s were still important. And the education system was morphed to help deliver those objectives. For example, I sit on an industry advisory board at an Australian university, and the school directors and persons crafting the curriculum are always asking us, is the content relevant for what you're looking for in graduates? Should they be focusing on one particular area more than another? That's just the way things are. And we are learning that the graduates now and those in 5-10 years will have a different relationship to their employer than we have had. Hence, we need to provide them with the skills, resources, and the mindset in order to deliver their needs as well. Now, the second element, which was part of the title, is society. And I, again, congratulate the designers of this conference, because it's not all about digital education, as we see often. Digital education is the solution, we hear. Well, it's not, because education needs to fit in with society. Your society in Indonesia has virtues and values which have been crafted over a long period of time, many generations. Yes, they're tweaked by current matters. We've seen experimentation. What do I mean by that? Well, we've seen, for example, the use of electronic resources, iPads, computers in schools, now introduced at a very young age. We were told when they were first introduced that this is the way of the future. Our children will be learning very differently to the way we were taught. As parents, you'd say, well, okay, let's proceed and see what happens. What has happened, particularly in the West, is that an over-reliance of electronic resources, iPads, has led to a slower development of certain cognitive skills of children. Now we're seeing a wind back of the use of iPads, not a total absence of iPads, but a measured use for particular activities only, because the experimentation led to a reconfiguration of the use. Fragmentation. Well, we don't want fragmentation in society. Yes, in some societies we have pluralist views, but we have to make sure that we are able to experiment, but not to the extent that it impacts on the foundations of our virtues and values in our society. Now, another part of education is to embed what I call the right values. Each society has its own values, which it considers the right values. And Aristotle once said that we're not really sure what the right values are, but it's somewhere between extremes. And those values are very specific to society. So we have to embed those values in education, as parents do with their children and as communities do with their citizens. It needs to retain its position within our educational practices. What actions need to be taken? We need to build relationships. And this is where our organization was created, and for that particular purpose. So let's talk about building relationships. This visual, I think, captures the element quite succinctly. People from different countries, people from different, shall we say, educational and life experiences, people from different resources. And let me be very clear, a developed society which has more material goods is not necessarily the society that we should all be following. When you look at values, often those societies have diminished values compared to societies who are less developed. So why do you build relationships? It provides for strength. It provides for new learnings. What types of learnings? Throughout this webinar, we will be illuminated by the use of technology and how that has led to amazing pieces of information and currency of information from around the world. When I was a kid, especially at primary school, the library was the resource using paper-based books. That has substantially been eroded, but not removed. Thinking about pedagogy. What teaching practices exist in, say, Somalia, in Indonesia, in Australia, etc., etc.? What emerging practices, what fashions are there? What underlying foundations cannot be shaken? Those learnings from different parts of the world are very informative and may be reflected back on what happens in your community, in your teaching environment. Innovation, problem solving, entrepreneurship. Now, they're words and sentiments which, for us at Global Opportunities Commercialization, are core values. They're not our virtues, but they're our core values. We want to see more of this in society. We want to see more of this in the young. By learning about how different societies manage these issues, you may reflect and say, we'll take some of those learnings and adopt them to our cultural context. And pursuant to the Memorandum of Understanding that we have signed today, we will communicate and impart some of our learnings to see whether they are relevant and may be adopted, again, in a socially relevant and pedagogical context in your community. Now, are there out-of-the-box learnings? Are there particular activities occurring in faraway places like Africa or emerging in developed countries, which you think, that's fascinating? I like the way they do that. I think that might be relevant in our communities. Are there familial and tribal relationships and learnings and values of respects and values education which are relevant in our society? And what we are seeing, particularly in the West, education tends to sometimes move to one polar end and then move to another, because parents and community observe out-of-the-box learnings from different parts of the world are not relatively and irrelevantly apportioned in their jurisdiction. Aligning values.
Excuse me, please. Yeah, you have 2 more minutes.
Thank you. Aligning values, very critical, because at the end of the day, each society has its virtues and values, and you want to make sure that you don't take on something that fits outside that, because it may fragment or damage your values. Looking for long-term friendships and partnerships, mutual understanding and respect. I'm absolutely positive that the number of MOUs that will be signed during this webinar will lead to wonderful long-term friendships and partnerships, generational partnerships, as well as mutual understanding and respect. So what do we do? Just as a reflection for a moment, global opportunities commercialization, and that image is of where we are in Melbourne, and that tall building right in the middle is level 27 is our office. So please, if you're visiting Melbourne, Australia, come and visit us. We would be honoured to host you and introduce you to our community. Our community is global. We don't just look at Melbourne. We look at Africa, Europe, our region in Southeast Asia, India, US, etc. We ensure that the partnerships we have share our values, virtues, and goals. If it doesn't do that, we don't want that partnership. Sounds very harsh, but it is true. And we seek a better community. We are very confident that from what we've heard today, these are the values shared by a number of the participants, and we welcome a partnership with you. And on that note, I thank you for your time and wish you all the very best for the remainder of the forum. Thank you, and beyond.